Despite being arch rivals, the car and motorcycle world have come together quite a few times over the past 100 years. Sometimes these collaborations have been interesting, like the Honda Pacific Coast, other times not so much. What we found is that it's quite difficult to meld these two machines into one without losing many of the best characteristics of both. But without a doubt, the best crossover motorcycle car dates back to the very beginning of motoring in the form of the cycle car. It's difficult to pinpoint what was the first cycle car. More than likely, it was earlier than what we think and was probably built by some random guy in his garage, but most point to French company Bedelia with their 1909 model. I should note that we know Morgan had worked on his own personal three-wheeled vehicle around this time as well, so that could definitely be the first cycle car because, that one was also defined as a cycle car and would race in cycle car racing. Looking at these early cycle cars is helpful for understanding what actually makes a cycle car. In essence, the idea was to bring together the worlds of two-wheeled and four-wheeled motoring to get the benefits of a motorcycle in the form of a car that is small and lightweight, a nimble, fun vehicle that's also incredibly economical and affordable. This was accomplished through two major changes to the traditional car. First, instead of being powered by a traditional car engine, it used a motorcycle engine, usually mounted in the front and often in the form of a V-twin. And second, instead of using regular car wheels, a cycle car used thin motorcycle wheels. Being rather underpowered and rolling on less stable wheels meant that the goal was to really keep the weight down. And these also often had very primitive suspension setups, so you wanted the thing to be light. Often they were single or double passenger vehicles, and they sat incredibly low to the ground. In many ways, the cycle car was a sort of precursor to the go-kart. And they really drove like go-karts as well. But as fun as they were, the whole point was affordable motoring that could be experienced by more people. It was essentially cheap transportation, and so many cycle cars were also made very cheaply, using things like wood frames. They were just very bare bones, basic forms of transportation. Aside from Morgan in Great Britain, Godfrey and Nash became known as one of the most popular manufacturers of cycle cars. GN focused on innovation, utilizing things like a friction drive transmission, which was basically a continuously variable transmission like what we see on a modern scooter. Not a perfect solution, but it was a move towards really continuing to simplify and make these cars affordable, which was really the idea behind these cars. By 1914 in America, some 80 manufacturers were producing cycle cars, and over in Europe there were hundreds of different manufacturers making these. Again, most of these were pretty garbage and not very well put together. In America, one of the most notable quality cycle cars was the McIntyre Imp, created by famed automotive designer William Stout and powered by a 12-horsepower V-twin capable of 50 miles per hour and weighing only 450 pounds. And this little cycle car had a genius transmission setup that basically mimicked a 4-speed automatic. This was one of the few American cycle cars that was also truly stylish and felt like a complete sort of holistic design instead of just kind of being slapped together like so many of them were. It and others like it fared well in local fair races, but cycle cars were kind of hooligan vehicles here in the States more than they were affordable means of transportation. Of course, the Model T would really be the affordable car. But in general, over in Europe, they took their cycle cars much more seriously than we did here. They were far more sophisticated and more reliable. Some were even powered by big 4-cylinder engines with complete, more traditional car features. Over in France, other companies sprouted up, making rather advanced, performance-oriented cycle cars, notably Cycle Cars Samson with their own sub-400-pound, super-fast cycle cars, which did really well in international racing. And that's right, cycle car racing was a massive part of the growth of these vehicles. Cycle car racing emerged alongside the development of cycle cars themselves. These lightweight, affordable vehicles with motorcycle-based engines were really well suited for racing due to their agility and relatively high power-to-weight ratio. At first, these races were informal, but in Europe, more organized professional racing of all kinds would foster improvements in technology. Again, Morgan would emerge with their three-wheeled cycle car at this time, proving that their car had incredible value in terms of racing right on the track. International races like the Grand Prix des Cyclecars and the 200-mile race at Brooklands would attract thousands. But sadly, this whole cycle car thing would be relatively short-lived. By World War I here in the States, it was pretty much entirely out of vogue, and by the mid-20s, it was pretty much done in Europe. In part, cycle cars didn't work great on actual roads because roads were terrible at this time, and it's much easier to avoid potholes on, a thin-wheeled motorcycle than it is on, a car with 4 motorcycle wheels. Traditional cars became more economical and more affordable, and also people began to enjoy the luxury of bigger, more capable machines, and so the cycle car died. But what's really interesting in this sort of historical footnote of automotive history is what the whole thing of cycle cars was really about. Just a few years after the release of these early cycle cars, the explosive growth of this movement and the creation of hundreds of new manufacturers making these fun little machines, a new magazine would be spawned in 1912 called the Cycle Car. This magazine and others like it were really a picture of what this movement was about. It really was an enthusiast's thing and a very homegrown take on motoring. And so the magazine would cover both everything from community events to good routes to technical info on various cycle cars, as well as tips on how to build and how to maintain these machines. Though the popularity of cycle cars would rise and fall even faster, really, and very few of the early cycle cars are still around, magazines like the Cycle Car are really a testament to the passion that these people had for these somewhat silly little vehicles. Those cycle cars would never make a full return, to the glory that they initially had, because I don't think anything quite like an old cycle car could ever really be street legal. We have seen quite a few automobiles that were influenced by these early machines, even, the microcars of the post-war era, to, of course, Morgan, who in some ways just kind of kept making cycle cars, though they obviously got bigger and became more like traditional vehicles, to vehicles like the Slingshot, which, is classified as a motorcycle, and to my favorite, the Pembleton Motor Company with their awesome, basically cycle cars. But over the past few decades, there's been a unique movement, one that really emulates the old world value that cycle car enthusiasts had, a spirit of do-it-yourself motoring and just good old-fashioned fun. And this is called the cycle kart movement. In 1995, two brothers named Peter and Michael Stevenson built what we now consider to be the first cycle kart. Not cycle car, cycle kart. Its name, the Type 59, made to look or be sort of a caricature of the iconic Bugatti Type 59. In the April Fool's 2002 edition of Road and Track, the specifications for the Type 59 cycle kart were published, with just $1,500 and probably, 1,500 hours of labor, you too could make one of these retro-styled go-karts. This cycle kart and the spirit behind it would lay the foundation for a grassroots movement known as the cycle kart movement. And this is directly from the cycle kart website. Cycle karts are even smaller than their ancestors, with featherweight monocoque frames, disc brakes, lightning quick precise steering, and a 200cc overhead valve, smog-approved engines, coupled up to Vari-Drive automatic transmissions. The result? More power than you really need. By the time you've hit the second turn, you've learned how to use your hips and body English to do most of the steering, and the rest is pure four-wheeled mayhem. You quickly get to feel like you could drive the little monster any which way you like, except perhaps in a straight line. Something known as the Stevenson formula, based on that original cycle kart from '95, would pave the way for cycle karting if you really wanted to be involved in the community and especially in cycle kart racing. You pretty much have to follow this. First, you have to build your own cycle kart, and you have to build it on a budget. You can't just drop, $15K on a cycle kart. In $2001, it costs no more than $1,750. That was the rules. That is $1,750. You also have to keep the car under 250 pounds, and it should be powered by Honda's GX200 four-stroke motorcycle engine. And you also have to use the wheels off of, pretty much a Honda Super Cub. They're just 17s that are really thin. Originally, the frames were all wood tub style, but there is some leeway there. And the point is that there's some standards. You can't and honestly don't want to soup up the engines of one of these. It won't be good. They won't drive better. And adding lots of weight to make your car faster is just against the whole spirit, not only of cycle karting, but also of cycle cars originally. Cycle carts don't have rear suspension and very rudimentary front suspension. And one of my favorite parts about cycle karting is that whatever kart you make, it's supposed to imitate and be a kind of small scale or caricature of a classic sports car. Pretty much all of them are from that cycle car era, teens, early 20s. So when you set out to make your cycle kart, you have to find the car that you want to imitate, and do tons of research on the overall form and dimensions of your car, and try to make it essentially look the same and also drive the same, which really isn't easy. But the idea is to be very rigid to what your inspiration car was. Your car should have the driving characteristics of that original car. Again, it's not about making your car as fast as possible, the way that it is in, typical go-karting. Building your own cycle kart, especially if you have no experience with this kind of thing, will be a huge learning process, and that's really the point. In the end, you have a car that it because you built it. It's fun, and it's kind of a somewhat scary concept to be driving a car, at the limit that you built, but that's the idea of motoring. Cycle karting is still a small community. There's no guarantee, there will be another cycle karter within 100 miles of you. And for whatever reason, the Pacific Northwest has kind of become a hub for all of it. If you do want to get involved, I'll put links in the description for you guys to check out. Now, because these cars sit so low to the ground and they're so lightweight, they really are like driving a kind of go-kart from the past. It really is go-karting, but because they're made to mimic old cars and they have these larger, skinnier tires, they don't really handle like go-karts. They're much more difficult to manage, like driving an old race car. So if you've ever wanted to experience an old race car from, say, the 20s, this is the way to do it. Now, I think what I find so fascinating about cycle karting is just how old school it is. It really is a kind of motoring like what we see in the early days when cycle cars became a thing. The idea is that you get to build and maintain your own car like people did in the very early days of motoring, and the way that, many cycle car enthusiasts did. You don't hear that term motoring very often anymore, and that's because motoring isn't something that most car enthusiasts are doing today. Motoring was originally a term used to describe motorcycle and car enthusiasts because these new modes of transportation had motors, and you had to understand that, and you had to understand how they worked, and you had to be able to work on your car or motorcycle. You had to understand it completely, or you wouldn't be able to get it running when it broke down. There weren't dealerships who could take your car for a few days and give you a loaner. There weren't diagnostic tools or roadside assistance. You had to understand your car completely and trust your own skills to be able to really drive it. And often your car would end up something that you had basically built because you would have changed so much. Today, many enthusiasts do understand their cars. They may know why they're fast or how they operate, but it's pretty rare for people to really work on and especially build their own cars and understand them the way that people did when motoring was a thing. And for me, cycle karting is a really cool way to experience that. It's an experience you really can't get anywhere else. To get the satisfaction of driving something that you made with your own hands and that you understand better than anybody else. If you guys are interested in making your own cycle kart, one of the best places to start would be to check out Steve Vinson's channel. He has lots of videos on building these and even plans that you can buy to get started. So I'll link his channel in the description below. Make sure to check it out. I'm sure in talking about cycle cars and cycle karts, there are many watching this video who have experience building these little machines and racing them. So we would love to hear from you guys in the comments below. And until next time, drive safe.